Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear? Okay, great. I understand you had a big party last night. I'm not going to ask anybody to stand up, just to be clear. In fact, feel free to go to sleep if you really are tired. But yes, I was asked to come this morning and talk a little bit about what's going on within the Linux community and ecosystem. Hopefully some of those things can be applied to your community. I think I mentioned to some folks this morning that Erlang and Linux are kind of like chocolate and peanut butter. I'm going to give you guys chocolate because I know everyone likes that better than the peanut butter. But if you think about it, our two communities have very similar backgrounds, very similar characteristics, and I think have the same kind of potential in terms of changing the face of computing. Not just what's going on today, which I think is incredible, but far into the future. You know, if you think about it, we share so many of the same characteristics. You know, the code for you guys was opened up, I think, in 1998. Is that correct? You know, both use permissive licenses. You know, your assumption is that things will fail. You know, and so it was, you know, it's really well suited for cheaper hardware. Clearly Linux, very, very similar in that case. Most of Linux early growth in particular was on cheap hardware, mainly because that's all Torvalds had. And you know, you're portable to many different architectures and OSs. Again, you know, Linux runs on more architectures than any other OS in the history of computing. So that allows people to hop across different architectures very, very easily. So very, very similar in some of the characteristics. Also, you know, both ideal for a huge area of growth in computing today for embedded applications. And I realize this is just one area where this technology is a very, very appropriate, but I thought I would highlight it. You know, today and in the future, and I'll talk about this later in my presentation, you know, we're making tons of connections daily, you know, and most of them are transparent and intermittent, right? And if you think about it, that brings a lot of challenges, right? You know, with more endpoints, you have more devices to build, more connections to manage, more failures to tolerate. And I think the combination of what Linux is doing and what you guys are doing really addresses a lot of these challenges. You know, when we look at the build out of the sort of Internet of Things, Linux is really becoming the de facto standard for that. In fact, you know, in the mobile computing world, unless your name is Microsoft, RIM, or Apple, nobody makes anything these days without Linux. So it really, because of its flexibility, the fact that it supports so many architectures, its low cost, and all the skills out there, Linux is really being used to build these devices. Well, when you build all these devices, there's lots of connections to manage. You know, the things that you guys are doing, the suitability for concurrency, for data isolation, all these things really, really are fitted to what your community is doing. You know, fault tolerance, be able to recover quickly, isolate failures, that's something that you guys have built into the whole design of what you're working on. And so these two things in tandem, I think, solve a lot of tough problems that are really proving that this development model, what I like to call the hacker way, sort of the way of collaborative development, the Linux community, the Erlang community are really proving that that works. Both our communities are growing very quickly. I think Linux got, you know, arguably a head start, and so it's a larger community at this point. But your community, from what I see, is growing hand over fist. Perhaps at a faster rate than Linux is at this time, and trust me, Linux is growing fast. And what's even more interesting, and what I'll explain from a Linux perspective, but I think it can also be applied to your community, is that we're solving big problems in the fastest growing segments of technology today. Today, we're in the middle of what I think most pundits out there would characterize as a disruptive time in computing, where the fundamental characteristics of the computing world are changing, and that disruptive time is where all the opportunity is for new technology to succeed, for new businesses to succeed, and for legacy businesses to either adapt or fail. And I'll show how both Erlang and Linux are really solving problems as these new markets and new problems emerge. And I think the most important thing is both Linux and Erlang solve a lot of these really, really hard problems at the lowest possible cost. And when I say that, it's low cost because of the nature of the technology. It's low cost because of the nature of the collaborative development which produces this technology. It just solves these problems in such an efficient way that I think it's going to be hard for rivals to compete with both of them. And so, the more I thought about it, it really is true that these two technologies, they often run together. They're really a lot like chocolate and peanut butter. But more importantly, I think we're all proving that this concept of collaborative development, again, the hacker way, is really working. And so when I think about the hacker way, one of the things that I'd like to ask all of you is whether or not you recognize a couple of the statements that I'm about to show you here on the screen. As you read these, think about who might have said this. Code wins arguments. Have you heard this before? Sounds vaguely familiar, right? The best idea and implementation should always win, right? You've probably seen this on mailing lists for 10, 20 years, right? And for anybody who participates in collaborative development, these are almost intuitive thoughts. Does anybody happen to know who actually said this? Both these statements? Anybody? Wow, there's always one wise guy in the crowd.
Bill Gates?
Close, but incorrect. It must have been a good party last night. Damn, I should have come over here. Excuse me. Was it this guy? Linus Torvalds? Sounds like something he'd say, right? We got a yes here. Torvalds? Does anybody say Torvalds? All right. Well, you're all wrong. It was actually this guy, Mark Zuckerberg. And it wasn't 10 years ago on a mailing list. It was about 2 months ago in his introductory letter to investors upon the eve of the most anticipated IPO of the decade. Mark Zuckerberg wrote a letter to the investors when he introduced their IPO, not talking about how great Facebook is, but about how important this concept of the hacker way is to Facebook. He talked about how collaborative development is a fundamental part of how Facebook works. Code wins arguments. The best implementation should win. It was so important to him that he wrote that up when he stands to make $100 billion, or Facebook, I think he gets 50 billion of that, when they're standing to make $100 billion off of this IPO. That's how powerful this concept of collaborative development is. Something that you guys have been known for, since 1998. Something the Linux community has known for over 20 years. Isn't something that people even think about these days. Mark Zuckerberg didn't say, I wonder if I should use .NET or Linux or Windows or Linux to write Facebook. It was just intuitively obvious to him. He took open source software and he created Facebook. And he believes in that method of development so much that he pointed it out on the eve of their IPO. And so I thought that's pretty impressive in terms of just how mainstream this type of development has become. And so when you think about it, the question is raised, why is the world, why did Zuckerberg instinctively choose Linux and open source to create all of this value? Why does Amazon, Facebook, Google, why did 90% of the world's equity trading platforms, why do most air traffic control systems, why do all these things now run on open source software and Linux? Yeah, it's worth asking, stepping back a second and asking yourselves, what is the bigger picture that's going on that's driving this consumption? I think everybody in this room, including myself, will argue that it's because the technology that we're all working on is so incredibly good that anyone would be a fool to choose anything else. And while I would like to think that, I think it's not, as many of you know who've been in technology for years and years and years, the technology alone doesn't always make for success. I would bag on Windows right now, but I've vowed to stop picking on Microsoft. But it is true. Technology doesn't always win. And so what's going on right now that's driving this incredible adoption of Linux, where it is #1 in embedded systems now, where it is #1 in computing, where it is #1 in mobile devices, where it is the fastest growing platform in the server space, where it's powering 700,000 Android activations a day? What is happening that's driving all of this growth? And so I have 3 reasons that I want to walk you through, and I hope these, and I believe these are applicable to what you're probably dealing with in your community as well. The first one certainly is. The first reason is the internet is fundamentally changing. And I think the work you guys are doing really is suited to meet this fundamental change. And what I mean by that is the internet's not just growing, right? There's, I think, 1 billion people online today. It's moving to 2 billion. We're somewhere in there, right? A couple billion people online. And I think that's interesting, the rate of growth of users of the internet. But what's really fueling the growth of the internet is the Internet of Things. That we're growing to trillions and trillions of devices being connected over the internet. I read an article the other day, I don't know if anyone saw this, where someone stated that a huge, maybe even up to 50% of all traffic over the internet is not actually generated by people. It's device-to-device communication or machine-to-machine communication. That's an incredible load. I think that's going to go up, by the way. As you connect more cars, as you make, all the things that we take for granted every day smarter and smarter, smart grid technology and so forth, the dynamic of what is required technically in this world dramatically changes. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the most simple example of this change in technical requirements by looking at the most simple example of an application within this new Internet of Things. And so, and admittedly, this is just the most simplistic example. I think we can all think of other much more complex examples. But this is just a power company in the southwestern part of the United States that has 1 million customers. And that company decided that they were going to build a smart grid system to enable better power utilization, more efficiency, and better service to their customers. And traditionally, a meter reader would go out to the 1 million customers that this company had and read the meter once a month. And that produced 12 million transactions a year, right? Guy goes out, writes it down, enters it into some place. When he gets back to the office, they send out a bill, 12 million transactions a year. Well, when you install smart meter technology that wirelessly transmits that data to a server, stores it, and analyzes it, just on a daily basis, obviously the number of transactions jumps significantly. Now, this power company's goal is to be able to read the meter every 15 minutes to be able to balance load and, again, be more efficient and serve their customer requirements better. When you start reading meters every 15 minutes in this scenario with 1 million customers, it's 35 billion transactions per year. The data load, the type of network you need, every component of the technology that's required by this company changes. And if you think about, again, in the most simplistic terms, what those changes might look like, you need a few types of new things. Again, this is the very basics of what you might need. But you need some kind of instrumentation, some sort of smart meter that can transmit wirelessly an embedded system to collect the data and transmit it. You need network servers to gather and store this data. You need supercomputers, high-performance computing to analyze this data explosion. And then you need mobile devices, increasingly tablets and other things, to be able to display, interact, and communicate with that data. And so I look at this world, and I'd like you to think about the technology you're all working on and think about this world of a vast increase of embedded systems, lots and lots of concurrent network connections, high performance computing, exploiting multi-core, new devices to display these on, embedded systems. Well, that all sounds pretty familiar, right? Linux is #1 in every category of these technologies that will be critical to this new Internet of Things. And I would argue Erlang is also going to be critical in this tech. We're at the tip of the iceberg in building out the Internet of Things. We're at the very beginning of the applications that are going to make life better in terms of transportation and weather forecasting and taking advantage of all this huge, huge amount of data that's being generated as more and more things get connected to the internet. And I think Linux is clearly situated to be a key component, almost a fabric of that computing trend, and so is Erlang. The second reason why people are adopting open source, and Linux in particular, is because it saves money. Now, I think everybody gets the saving money thing, right? Sounds like you guys got the free as in beer thing a little too much last night, right? But I don't want to talk about why Linux or open source software or free software saves money in the aspect that it's just cheap. Red Hat yesterday, I think it was day before yesterday actually, on their quarterly earnings call announced that they broke $1 billion in revenue. Actually, they didn't just break it, they blew it out. It was $1.2 billion in revenue annually, they announced. Clearly, free software is something that you can make money off of, and it's not necessarily free as in beer. But it does save money in some very important ways that I thought I would point out to you that solves a lot of big challenges for the industry today. When I go to talk to consumer electronics companies, embedded systems companies, more and more they're saying that their world has changed dramatically and they're struggling to meet up with those challenges. And when they say that their world has changed, what's happening is the old model for a consumer electronics maker, for example, and I'll just use them as an example, was you would build a Walkman or some, I don't want to pick on Sony too much, but you get it, a Walkman or some kind of device, and it would cost a certain amount to make. And then you would sell that, if you look here on my right, in the market, and generally, you'd have these things for like 3-4 years, right? I mean, even not too long ago, a basic cell phone, which was primarily used for voice communication, lasted, 2-3 years. You'd have this thing, right? And so these were relatively uncomplicated devices. I think the hardware design was very sophisticated. The industrial design, the way that they matched these devices to the market was good. But they weren't super expensive to make, and they lasted in the market a long time. Right? So you could make a lot of money off of that investment you made in creating these devices. And that model is fundamentally changing today because you guys are all throwing your cell phones away every 12 months. And it's not just you guys, the kind of vanguard of tech adoption. It's almost everyone. Technology just doesn't last in the market these days. Apple, as an example, is producing every 12 months, a new device coming out, new device coming out. People are lining up around the blocks for these things. It's unbelievable, right? The point being that there's not as much time to monetize these things in the market. So that sucks. Less time to make money doesn't make for a profitable business. But the other problem is that the cost of creating a breakthrough device has gone up exponentially in just a massive way. And when I ask people, can you give me specifics on what is driving all of this cost for you to create these interesting devices and experiences? They say it's all about the software. That software development has really, really raised the bar in terms of cost. If you look at a phone today, and we're really moving towards a world of smartphones is a phone, right? There's no, I always hear this argument, well, for people who don't have enough money, maybe they just want a feature phone. They don't need a smartphone. I'm like, they're poor. They're not idiots, right? I mean, everybody's going to have a smartphone. They're just going to get a little less expensive. But the cost of creating these it's a full-blown operating system with lots of applications and network connectivity and has so much more functionality than was ever had in these previous generations of device. That's all software-driven. That's expensive development, and it's hard to do. And so in order to meet that challenge, what people are doing is transferring that internal development cost externally. Sharing in the development of non-differentiated software, in the case of Linux for the underlying kernel, most of the device support and many of the critical libraries that are used to build these devices, and only focusing on the things that really add value to their customers and differentiate their business. And so by using this collaborative development, they're not just saving money in the sense that the software itself is free, they're saving money in the fact that innovation now becomes better, faster, cheaper. That is what I mean by collaborative innovation. What we're all doing saves money. Not only does it save money in terms of production, but it allows for new value creation because based on the licenses of this software, you actually own your own intellectual property. You don't have to go ask Microsoft or Apple for permission to create your own app stores or your own services, right? And that's what people are doing. And increasingly, we're moving towards a world where those services are where people make money, and those services are increasingly being deployed and created using open source software. And that leads me to the third and sort of final main reason why the world is, during this disruptive period, is choosing open source and Linux, is because we really are moving towards a services model of computing across the board. So in my world, most software will be free, right? People will open source software and create incredible new things. And this idea of going out and licensing expensive proprietary software is just going away. And I'll just, I'll put myself out there on a limb and say this trend is showing no signs of slowing down. We're not going to rewind the clock to the days where proprietary software ruled the roost. But there's something more interesting going on than just this trend towards free software. I would postulate that hardware will also be free. Nobody's going to make any money. All right, so hardware will be free, but what I mean by that is not that people won't be able to build software and to sell it to people. The customers are just going to be different. If you think about it, free can be a new model where hardware just becomes the delivery platform for a service. And that, I think, is the future that we're all going to face. The best example and the leading indicator of this is probably Amazon at this point. I mean, here Amazon hosts three, of the most dynamic service opportunities in technology. Their cloud services. Anybody who's an Amazon Prime customer, which I am, you gotta love it. So the shopping as a service, and then the Kindle Fire. And when they announced this, I love this quote from Jeff. They don't think of the Kindle Fire as a product. They think of it as a service. They lose money on the hardware. It costs more money to make a Kindle Fire than the cost of actually purchasing it as a consumer. And if you look at where all of the hot value is being created in the consumer world, where Google AdWords probably being a quintessential service, right? Just creating billions of dollars in value, but streaming videos like Netflix, Amazon's App Store, Rhapsody, all of these, there's just dozens and dozens. Erlang is behind a lot of these type of internet services. The world is increasingly moving towards that services model. I mean, when's the last time anybody in this room even bought a DVD, right? I just think that people are going to stream these more and more in the future, and really things are going to be services-based. And it's not just in consumer services. happening in cloud computing as well. And whatever you want to call cloud computing, it is definitely buzzword worthy. I agree with that. I was part of a startup back in the late 90s that did application. It was an application service provider. We were doing hosted enterprise software. And then it became software as a service, and now it's cloud computing, and then platform as a service. But I think you get the gist. It's a service, right? It's software that is hosted somewhere that people consume as a service. Smart startups in Silicon Valley today, again, sort of a canary in the coal mine for technical trends, don't buy any hardware or software these days. They don't need to raise even much venture capital these days because they can create an idea, they can fire it up in the cloud, they can build it using open source software. Their cost of capital, their ability to experiment with new ideas to raise the innovation bar higher is so much more efficient in this services economy. And in this services economy, open source clearly wins. And the easiest way to think about it is to think about it in terms of these tremendously successful service platforms on the internet today. Could any companies be the companies they are today? Could Google be who they are today if they had written Google search using Microsoft.net? I mean, I don't think they could be who they are today. I don't necessarily think it's a technical reason, but they needed to control their intellectual property, their own destiny. They needed to tweak it in a way that they could optimize for their particular company. And so they chose open source software to do that. And so did Zuckerberg, and so did Amazon. And I think that trend is irreversible. And when you look at any new company, they pretty much all are doing the same thing. And so what Linux is a part of, and what I think you guys are a part of, is being at the center of this set of disruptive forces that are happening in technology today, where the change to an Internet of Things, the need for economic efficiency in producing innovation, and this move to services allow us to be uniquely positioned for that change. And I think there's even one bigger reason than that I'd like to continue to remind you guys as your community continues to grow. I'll make a prediction right now. I think this room will have twice as many people next year. I think your community is growing that fast, and I love this technology. I think it's that important. And the importance of being on the right side of history is also something that I think the Linux community can share with you. And what I mean by that is, last year was Linux's 20th anniversary. And for those of us who've been a part of the Linux community for a long time, we have seen so many naysayers, so many reasons why Linux sucks. I am the world's expert on why Linux should fail and how much it sucks, I assure you, because I've heard it all, right? It's not technically good enough. It's just for hobbyists, right? The legal underpinnings of the licensing model are an abomination to intellectual property rights, right? It'll never work. Nobody can make money with open source, right? I've heard everything. And every single time, history has proven Linux right. You can make money. The legal structure and licensing mechanisms are not only sound, they fit business, as I just showed. The technology evolves at a pace of innovation that cannot be matched. Because it's more than just this. There are almost 3 million lines of code added to Linux every year. There are 10,000 lines of code added to the Linux kernel every day. More importantly, there are about 5,000 that are subtracted every day, which is equally important, as you all know. The collective R&D value of the world's largest collaborative development effort is over $10 billion. That cannot be matched. But we did something more than that with Linux, and I think you can do something more than that with Erlang. And that is, we are the existence proof that collaborative development is a better way of innovating, and have spawned not just a technical movement, but an entire genre about how to innovate. There are hundreds of books. It's expanded beyond just IT into pharmaceuticals and mining and other aspects of global industry. The idea that any one of us is not as smart as all of us collectively. And that is, I think, what's going to make your community succeed over long periods of time. You have the right technology at the right time, you have the right development model, and you're on the right side of history. So I want to wish all of you luck, and know that at the Linux Foundation we are definitely rooting for you, because we are obviously fellow travelers in this world. And I want to thank you for your time. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
Excuse me, covering from a cold. One question back there? Do we? Go ahead.
For some of us who have been around the block a few times, I have heard that of the hardware is going to be free 95, 96. You remember they were giving away the computers, you just have to access internet.
I was in grade school, but no, I understand.
You may recall that. So what's different now? So the question is, what do you think is now different?
Yeah.
You can subscribe to service, get the hardware for free, and then start building up on that one.
Yeah, you're definitely right in that this has been predicted over and over again. You know, the way I look at it is, in order to really achieve this, you need a confluence of a few characteristics. You need relatively widespread connectivity, right, first of all, in order to be able to provide these services in any meaningful way. You need the development of new service business models in order to do this. On the enterprise side, I'll just give you an example. You almost needed, because I wasn't actually in junior or in grade school, but you know, I'll give you one personal example for that. Back in 1998, when I started with this company called Choreo, we were hosting ERP applications. We were basically hosting PeopleSoft and Oracle apps, back office applications, front office applications. And you know, our cost of delivering that service absolutely blew. It sucked. And here's why. We were running, you know, PeopleSoft on a Spark machine with a Solaris operating system and an Oracle database with BEA middleware, with, you know, an expensive ERP application on top of that. We were running it over very, very expensive pipes. The telecommunications costs at that time were very, very expensive. And all of those things have dramatically changed. God, you know what, if we had had sort of the type of cloud computing models that you're seeing today, the type of open source software that can build it, the type of, you know, multi-tenant web architected applications that you see today, the broad and lower cost connectivity, if we had had that back then, I would not be speaking to you now, because I would be rich and I wouldn't even work. You know, we went public the summer of 2000 and we really struggled. The #1 risk statement in our S1 was we don't own the software we host, right? You know, it was tough. And so I think, you know, that's just one example of where you've had this confluence of freely available, really kick-ass technology like Erlang, like Linux. You have broad connectivity. You have commodity hardware that this stuff can be built upon. You have manufacturing processes that enable Amazon to create a $200 Kindle. You know, I think that's a big breakthrough, by the way. You know, I look at that confluence and I say, you know, that really means something. You know, I'll give one counterexample where, you know, why hasn't Google's Chrome OS taken off? I would argue it's not a technical challenge. I mean, I love Chrome, right? I think, you know, if you're an IT ops guy, Chrome is awesome, right? Security, deployment, all of that is so much better in that model. Chrome's biggest problem is a pricing problem. Nobody wants to pay $500 for that computer, right? It should be free with a Google app subscription or something else, right? That allows you to offset and subsidize the cost of that. The industry that probably understands that the most, and again is another leading indicator of why this works now, is the wireless telecommunications industry here in the United States, where phones are free, right? Why are phones free? Because the average revenue per subscriber on a monthly basis multiplied by the lifetime of that subscriber, subtracted the cost of customer acquisition and the cost of goods sold, the subsidy on the phone, allows them to make money, right? And so that's how software will be delivered in the future. And so I think it's that confluence of things. We're not completely there. Particularly in cloud computing, I think we're very early on in developing the right types of infrastructure models, particularly on the ops side. And don't even get me started on how much carriers just need to, just the whole capital expense behind building out the networks and doing that efficiently, it just sucks. But we're getting really, really close. And that's why I do think this time it will work. Another question?
When I started off in IT, we would kind of use a dumb terminal into a mainframe. Everything was server side. You didn't have much computing. Client side.
Yeah.
The shift, the paradigm completely shift the other way. You've got these smart terminals. Client side. Now we're shifted back again. Will that shift happen again?
Well, so here's what's so ironic about that. So every time I tell my dad about things I'm working on, my grandfather was in the computing business. He was one of the founders of Cray Research. My dad worked at, I don't know if anybody remembers Control Data, and he worked on mainframes and supercomputers. And every time I tell him about something cool that's going on in Linux, he just is like, oh my God. We did that like 30 years ago, right? And the whole idea of sort of this client-server architecture that's killing me today is when I look at, does anybody here have an iPhone? Fess up, all right, that's cool. It's like we've regressed back to client-server, right? Like I thought we were going with web architecture, and then Apple comes out, and now it's all Objective-C and client-side executable. It's killing me. I think that naturally, at least on my experience in terms of dealing with IT ops people day in, day out, the web model, the thinner client model that you described is preferable, and we'll probably land somewhere. I hate it when business guys say this about technology, it's somewhere in between, right? But clearly JavaScript and things like that are creating a little bit more, heavy client, executable stuff. But I think that, things like HTML5 and a lighter client are where the industry will tend to go over time. I just have no explanation for how the iPhone and iPad have just regressed us back to client server other than Steve Jobs is a genius, right? He sucked us all back into that world. I think that world does end up changing and going back towards a more web architected, lighter client side. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. But if I was an IT ops guy, I would not want to be updating a bunch of Objective-C applications all the time. That totally sucks. Just security alone, that sucks. So, any other questions? I know you guys are all tired. All righty, well, thank you very much for your attention today. I hope it was mildly entertaining when you guys are all tired, and I hope to see you guys again next year. Thank you.